Hi everyone. So I'm going to pick up on some of the institutional threads that Peter opened with and really ask you to think about the museum as a site for critical technology discourse this afternoon. Brief introduction to myself. I am a senior lecturer, writer and consultant, and my work really sits at the intersection of visual arts, technology and audience development. And I'm based within the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths. My research and teaching falls under what I call critical praxis. So it seeks to link theory and practice to effect a positive change within the wider cultural sector. It broadly looks at digital innovation, but in recent years I'm increasingly focusing on data and AI. And so the question that I bring to you today is not what are the possibilities of generative art, but instead, what are the worlds that we're building for generative art to exist within? And I think that question is best placed by looking at how museums, libraries and archives have answered similar questions over the past 100 years and more. If we think about how museums, libraries and archives started, it was quite often rich white men getting on their boat and discovering new worlds, bringing new objects, new ideas, new cultures back to the West. And in many ways, we could describe AI technologies and generative art as the new world. But one of the great things about looking to museums, libraries and archives is we can see how they first developed and categorized systems to understand these new worlds. But crucially, we can also see how they've got them wrong. We know that there's issues with colonization in museums. It's the basis of many museums, but also there's issues around discrimination, about problematic languages and taxonomies. So quite often when we talk about AI, we talk about starting from the beginning, but actually much of the conversation today around how do we describe these systems and processes have been happening within the field of museum studies for many hundreds of years. And I quite like this quote when we placing this into the wider context of museum studies. So if we look at the second bit, collecting and organising can be a means of making sense and gaining knowledge of the world. Removing objects from their pre-existing worlds of use and arranging them in dedicated, designated space allowed meaning and order to be discerned in the unruly and teeming world of things. So I think that's quite a nice description of where we are when it comes to AI and art. It's a pretty unruly and teeming world of things. So many hundreds of years ago, museums decided, well, we need to start developing a language. We need to start to develop a catalogue, a systematic way of understanding these new and emerging knowledges. Quite often it started on a piece of paper, a card. And then taxonomy started to develop, hierarchies of knowledge and power, ways to describe new worlds were established. And I think many of the speakers today have spoke about the challenge, the need to build new worlds, new ways to understand these new hierarchies and taxonomies. And for me, developing and adopting these models of taxonomies and hierarchies of knowledge helps us to move beyond this cabinet of curiosities, which I think looks very much like the messy world of generative art today. So if we look to museums, we can start to create processes that will allow us to build worlds from which to understand how these technologies can really change and influence society. Because if generative art exists online and is not seen or discovered by anyone, does it really exist? Does it actually have any impact? All of the technologies we've talked about today are not interesting purely for the technology or purely for what they produce. They're interesting to us because of the impact they have on wider society, on our lives, on our social lives, on our cultural experiences. So it's not the process, it's not the product, but it's the impact that they have. And I think that's where museums can serve as a really useful third space for creating these conversations and these platforms for what technology futures might look like. And so it's from that basis that in 2019 I was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to establish the Museums and AI Network. And this network set about developing a conversation around AI, ethics and museums. And again, this wasn't a new conversation. Ethics is a hot topic in museums and has been for a very long time. So it was applying existing conversations about ethics in museums to this emerging field. The network brought together a number of large national institutions in the UK and the US and was co-founded by the National Gallery and the Met. It was very much designed as a benchmarking project to establish what current practices exist within museums, but also to establish emerging areas and challenge for this area of work. So one of the things we did as a network is that we mapped 120 projects that were currently live in museum institutions that were using AI technology. And we took AI in its broadest sense. So some of these are chatbots, some of these are predictive analytics, some of these projects are computer vision. But in 2019-2020, we had 120 fully documented case studies of AI, which might shock some people because a lot of people think museums are really old and boring. But actually, for me, they're spaces at the cutting edge of emerging culture. They're not places that simply show and document culture. They're places where culture is made and built. And once we'd done this benchmarking work, we defined two core areas of study. The first was looking at AI and visitor data. And I'm not going to focus too much on that today, but that's an area that looks very much at operational. How do you sell more tickets? How do you use predictive analytics to help you name an exhibition? The second area of study, which is more relevant to this meeting today, focuses on AI and collection data. And these questions were generated by small group meetings in London, New York, and San Diego, primarily with directors of digital at these large national institutions. And so the questions at that time they were asking were, what are the opportunities and challenges to apply AI technologies to collections data? How can museums minimize algorithmic biases to interpret their collections? What would the lack of diversity in the museum and AI fields reflect in the outcomes of these technologies? And what are the implications of museums engaging with big tech companies? What are the issues around ethics and data transfer, but also around IP? And the third core idea that came out of this group's work was the development of the term critical technology discourse as a theoretical framework from which to examine how cultural organisations can critically engage with technology and the impact these organisations can have by being open and accountable about the technologies they're using, and through public programmes and contemporary collecting to develop a digital literacy of visitors. Museums are not commercial spaces, so they're in a unique third place where they can be more transparent about how they're using data as a means of digital enlightenment, much like they were set up to do 100, 200 years ago when the focus on enlightenment was about educating the poor because people that read better would be more profitable for the capitalist system. This is today's version of digital capitalism within the wider social construct of the museum. So this network brought together a variety of universities and museums, but we also crucially held public programme events. So we held events at the Barbican in London and the Cooper Hewitt in New York because we really sought to engage visitors in this conversation in defining this emerging field of study, because we couldn't talk about visitor ethics if we didn't talk to visitors. So I'm just going to do a little bit of signposting here. The network produced a series of AI planning toolkits, which Luba has contributed to. And so we have an English language version, a Spanish version, and a German version. And each of them has country-specific case studies. They're free and open access, so please do use them. And they've been used quite widely now across Europe and America. I'm going to point out very briefly 3 examples of how museums are using these technologies and how they're explaining their use of these technologies crucially, so thinking about critical technology discourse. This is a really lovely application from Harvard Art Museum, and it's their AI Explorer tool. It allows you to click through their collection and look at how 4 different computer vision tools categorize their work. It's really interesting when you look at very literal objects. It's quite good. This is a piece of contemporary art. But Microsoft thinks it's probably a bathroom with some graffiti on the wall, and it's also categorized as a shower curtain. So thinking about explainable AI, lovely example from Harvard. This is an example from the Science Museum group developed by John Stack for one of our events. Similar concept, but looking at the Science Museum's collection. Simple refresh, you get a new object, you get a new categorization. Again, really good at thinking about how the machine thinks or algorithmic ways of seeing. It's not so good on technical data. So this is a glass specimen bottle containing skins of silkworms, currently too advanced for the computer to understand what this is. I think we're some way off. Final example then, and these are all discussed in these free open access toolkits, is the Met, who have been using computer vision to generate tags to make their digital collection more searchable, but they've been using human augmentation. So they're not trusting the machine, instead they're generating tags with computer vision tools, and then they're asking digital volunteers to agree, verify, or question what the machine's generated. So trying to meld together this explainable AI, but also engaging visitors in creating the tags so that the searchable collection has been created by them. Okay, so the classic clips, AI is messy, the media doesn't understand it. And again, this is where museums come in. Critical technology discourse can provide hope, aspirations, solutions, and crucially, digital literacy. So this is a really nice example of an artist being commissioned to respond to a collection. This is the work of Trevor Paglin that was shown at the Barbican collection in 2019. And this really helps us to explain how the computer sees and the challenges of how computers see. So in this image, we see a reproduction of Magritte's 1964 painting entitled, "This is not an apple." The work by Magritte is a painting of an apple with the words "Sinne and Pan." This is not an apple painted across the top of the painting. Paglin has added an additional layer to the photographic reproduction of this painting and included categories or tags that the ImageNet training set identified on this image. So for me, this is a really nice walkthrough of critical technology discourse in the museum, of providing artists with a platform to take art and culture away from the black box to explainable AI. If we walk through this process of seeing, we can begin to understand where the tensions lie in the application of computer vision technologies or algorithmic ways of seeing. The machine sees an apple. On first look, we see an apple. The artist tells us not an apple. It's pretty complicated. However, the human viewer can engage with this work as a surrealist provocation. The computer, or more specifically algorithm, struggles to see beyond the literal. It's an apple, nothing more, nothing less. This very short example provides so much more insight than the clickbait articles that don't quite explain how the system works. They simply tell us we should be afraid. And so, that is why I argue that museums and cultural centres can provide a valuable platform for critical technology discourse. They can be brave, curious advocates for art that ask questions and challenges power. Museums are a crucial, non-commercial space where we can ask difficult questions of these emerging technologies. Thank you.